Yo, do you know the history of gender affirming surgery and the rise and fall of gender identity clinics in America? Well, let's talk about that shit then. What's up, my beautiful people? What's up? I'm your host, Lo, and you're back. We're back. Welcome back at The Bistro. This is a safe space where we tell stories of and from marginalized and disenfranchised communities and their connections to current events today. Basically, we're a history podcast. And this week's topic is gender and sexuality as we discuss the history of gender affirming surgery and gender identity clinics in America. So be prepared. Whew. Okay, I hope that sounded okay. I think that in my headphones it sounded decent, but we'll see about that. And hey, the mouse ears still hasn't come for me, but hey, they have other stuff. They have bigger fish to fish to fly, fish to fly. What are we doing? Fish to fry here in Florida, child. Cause there's a mess. There's a whole bunch of mess going on here, child. A whole bunch of mess. So I don't think they worry about me, but you never know. So hey. Hey, and although this is not part of our Queer Miami series, the information within this episode will provide further context to the next episode in our Queer Miami series. So just be on the lookout for that. That is still happening. I'm not saying that's not happening. That is still happening. But I just wanted to kind of get this episode out first, so it can provide a little further context and a little foundation for that next Queer Miami series episode. Side note. So the field of medicine and society has evolved to better understand the experiences of trans individuals, and terminology has changed significantly throughout the years. There are times in which old terminology will be referenced for historical context, but I'll try to limit such terms as they are antiquated, harmful, and triggering. I understand. Trust me, I understand. So, well, bitch, go ahead, grab your vice of choice, and let's spill some tea on how patriarchy once again ruins everything here at The Bistro. Picture this. You have a special medical condition that you need taken care of, so you schedule an appointment with the specialist at a clinic. You're told that there's an application process. You trust the medical professionals, so you go through with it. After a lengthy and personally invasive process, you're denied the service because you do not meet the parameters set by those in charge of the clinic. That doesn't discourage you, though. You just continue to apply, but you're turned away again and again. Finally, you're at your wit's end, and you hear from people that have gone through the process. They tell you to lie when answering certain questions because the doctors are looking for a particular type of patient. So you decide to go ahead and tell that lie, and you're miraculously approved to receive the medical care that you need. This is the story of Lou Sullivan and hundreds and thousands of other transgender and gender nonconforming people that were denied hormone replacement therapy and gender affirming surgery. All because their sexual preference did not meet the heteronormative parameters set by doctors and other medical professionals. Still echoed in today's society, unfortunately, this narrative has also been a reality for many other marginalized communities in this country throughout its history. Let's explore the history of gender affirming surgery and gender identity clinics in America next. An estimated 1.4 million Americans, that's approximately 0.6% of the population, identify as transgender. Transgender and gender non-binary individuals, TGNB, have existed since the beginning of time and in cultures throughout the world. For example, the Indian subcontinent has recognized a third gender community since ancient times. In Western medicine, however, the modern era of gender-affirming surgery began at the Institute of Sexual Research in Berlin, Germany, under the leadership of Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld. One of the earliest known gender-affirming surgery procedures performed in the U.S. was for a patient, Dr. Alan Hart, a transgender man who underwent a hysterectomy in 1910. Dr. Hirschfeld, who could easily be considered the father of transgender healthcare, coined the term transvestite in 1918. Defining as a desire to express one's gender in opposition to their defined sex, Hirschfeld and his colleagues used this now antiquated label as a gateway to the provision of sex-changing therapies and as a means to protect their patients. Dr. Hirschfeld was one of the first to offer his patients the means to achieve sex change through hormone therapy, sex change operations, or both. In 1922, Hirschfeld performed castration on Dora Richter, one of the Institute's employees who later went on to complete her sex reassignment in 1931. The Institute's most famous patient was arguably Danish painter Lily Elbe, whose life story has been fictionalized in the popular film The Danish Girl. Starting in 1930, Elbe had 5 surgeries performed as part of her male-to-female transition. And unfortunately, Elbe died from infection-related complications of her final surgery in 1931. Now, around the same time that Dr. Hirschfeld's Institute began performing vaginoplasties, the father of plastic surgery, Sir Harold Gillies, had been refining techniques of genital construction in Britain. He primarily operated on British men who had sustained genital injuries during wartime. In the 1940s, he performed the first known phalloplasty for a transgender patient on Dr. Michael Dillon, a British physician. Dr. Gillies later performed a vaginoplasty on patient Roberta Cowell in Britain. In America during the 1940s, biologist Dr. Alfred Kinsey, who founded the Institute of Sex Research at Indiana University, now known as the Kinsey Institute, was one of the first to use the term transsexual in his gender studies. Side note, Okay, so definitely look up Dr. Kinsey and his contributions to sex and gender research. It is vast. I know there was a movie, I believe in like the late 90s or early 2000s, but I'm not going to recommend that because I have not seen it in years, and we all know how, a little wild the 90s and 2000s were, and we're in different times now, so I would recommend it, but I'm not going to because I don't want to be involved in that mess, child. But definitely look up Dr. Kinsey. Go ahead and do your own research on Dr. Kinsey and his research. Now, the first American to undergo a sex change operation was Christine Jorgensen. She brought significant attention to the trans community in America when her story hit the New York Times headlines in 1952. Now, her willingness to publicly tell her story helped bring a face to the growing trans revolution in the States. But at the time, the lack of quality transgender healthcare meant that Jorgensen had to travel to Denmark to get the treatment that she needed. Following her successful treatment in Denmark by Dr. Christian Hamburger, Many other transgender Americans wrote to Hamburger for the surgery. Hamburger referred those individuals to endocrinologist Dr. Henry Benjamin, who had offices in both New York City and San Francisco. Now, Dr. Benjamin's 1966 book, The Transsexual Phenomenon, left the most indelible impact on Americans' transgender healthcare. See, at the time, many psychiatrists and physicians believed that the correct approach to treating trans patients was exclusively through psychoanalytic therapy aimed at altering the desire to live as a different gender. And having spent time with Dr. Hirschfeld at his Berlin Institute, Dr. Benjamin supported the principles that those who feel their sex to be at odds with their gender deserve treatment in the form of hormonal therapy and reassignment surgeries and not psychotherapy for a quote-unquote cure. Side note, now, being trans during that time was treated as a mental disorder medically. And actually, it wasn't until 2019 that the World Health Organization no longer considered being trans a mental illness. Now, that's wild, y'all. That's wild. That was 3 years ago. That was almost 3 years ago, people. Come on now. Come on. While several major academic centers had internally discussed the formation of research institutes to study transgender patients since the early 1960s, Hopkins was the first to open and to start public recruitment for research on gender-affirming surgery. We'll discuss the rise and fall of gender identity clinics in America after the break. Whereas gender-affirming surgery was a new endeavor for American physicians, these clinics primarily operated as research programs. You see, physicians involved in these gender identity clinics describe feeling pressured to demonstrate successful post-operative outcomes in order to justify their work. So doctors felt pressure to provide quantitative results. This ultimately led to treating trans patients more like lab rats than actual human beings. Stanford University opened their gender dysphoria program in 1968. Lou Sullivan, who we introduced in the introduction, was one of these transgender patients at the clinic. When he decided to pursue hormone replacement therapy, a friend advised him against seeking care at Stanford's clinic, warning him that, quote unquote, they wouldn't touch you with a 10-foot pole. Lou worried that doctors would refuse him care because, quote unquote, I don't have the typical transsexual story they want to hear. And what they wanted to hear were trans stories that fit their heteronormative, cisgender narratives of transness. This produced medical mistrust with transgender patients throughout the country. You see, medical narratives are empowering. They allow patients to make sense of the pain and or trauma they have experienced and to take agency over their own lives. Many trans patients' narratives were shaped by doctors who had the power to withhold or grant access to gender-affirming surgery. The paternalistic model of care adopted by gender clinics forced trans people to manipulate their narratives, to withhold information, and to tell doctors exactly what they wanted to hear in order to receive care. The practice of extreme gatekeeping and refusing access to gender-affirming care was perfected by doctors who wanted to increase their medical authority. The Johns Hopkins Gender Identity Clinic became a model for other university-based gender clinics. The clinic was initially intended to be an experimental investigation into the effects of transition-related surgery. The clinic was funded by the Erickson Educational Foundation, an organization which aimed to, quote-unquote, support radical and controversial research efforts, particularly in the areas of psychology and transsexualism. For doctors at the Hopkins Clinic, the most important result was not the ability to provide life-changing medical care to an underserved community, but rather the opportunity to determine precisely what constitutes a transsexual and what makes him remain that way, quote unquote. Child. Rather than seeking to provide a stable and long-lasting source of transition-related medical care, cisgender doctors use these clinics to advance their careers and medical knowledge through scientific experimentation on trans patients. In an attempt to obtain good results, these clinics often maintain rigorous selection criteria that excluded a number of patients. The evaluation process required that patients undergo hormone treatment and live for a set period of time as the gender to which they intended to transition. This period of time could extend up to 5 years, y'all. 5 years, depending on the clinic, imposing a significant burden on patients and their lives. Individuals who are considered traditionally attractive, misogyny, to be easily perceived as a member of the other sex, patriarchy, as well as individuals who are heterosexual per their gender identity, were considered better surgical candidates. Get this, y'all. Out of 2,000 applications sent to the clinic within 2 years of its opening, only 24 patients underwent an operation. Again. Out of 2,000 applicants, they only allowed 24 patients to receive care. That's bonkers. That's wild. Now, the Johns Hopkins and Stanford clinics, for example, created a 4-step process used for quote-unquote screening, evaluating, treating, and following the patient. Screening involved an application form which features 6 pages of questions about personal history, mental health, marriage, and financial status. The application to the Stanford Clinic featured an extended list of open-ended questions, even asking patients to write a 1-page autobiography, y'all. Come on. Patients also had to discuss topics such as their family upbringing, academic and social life, and to reveal their sexual history and preferences. Applicants also received invasive and probing questions such as, quote-unquote, prior to hormone treatment, were your sex organs normal in size, shape, and function? If no, please list any abnormalities or suspected abnormalities. What? Applicants were subjected to hours of testing, only to be told that the clinic was not accepting new patients. In their 1976 article about sex changes, quote unquote, the U.S. National Observer described the screening process as, quote unquote, meticulous, designed to exclude applicants who are primarily homosexual, transvestic, or psychotic. This further shows that the evaluation process was meant to exclude patients who failed to meet cis heteronormative, neurotypical standards. The Johns Hopkins procedure for screening and evaluating patients was copied, refined, and adapted by at least 40 more gender identity centers by 1976, y'all. The practice of gatekeeping care was widespread throughout university-based gender clinics. At Johns Hopkins University, a new chair of psychiatry, Dr. Paul McHugh, was hired in 1975. He disapproved of offering gender-affirming surgery to trans patients. He acknowledged that from the moment he was hired, and he intended to stop this practice at the clinic. So, in 1979, a controversial study led by Dr. John K. Mayer, the former director of the still operational Sexual Behaviors Consultation Unit at Johns Hopkins, claimed to find, quote unquote, objective evidence that there is no real difference in the transsexuals' adjustment to life in terms of jobs, educational attainment, marital adjustment, and social stability following surgical intervention. Despite criticism and the claim directly contradicting a growing body of evidence that found significant benefit for trans patients after surgery, the study led to the closure of the Gender Identity Clinic in 1979. Now, another gender identity clinic where operations were abruptly terminated was the Baptist Medical Center in Oklahoma City. The Gender Identity Foundation at the center had offered a variety of services for trans patients, including gender-affirming surgery since 1973, while under the radar of local religious leaders. In 1977, however, the issue of gender-affirming surgery was brought to the attention of the board of directors of the Baptist General Convention of Oklahoma. The physicians involved advocated to be allowed to continue their practice. They issued a joint statement that said, quote unquote, if Jesus Christ were alive today, undoubtedly he would render help and comfort to the transsexual. Despite these appeals, the board of directors voted 54-2 to ban gender-affirming surgery at the Baptist Medical Center. To justify medical intervention and establish authority over transgender people, physicians created a medicalized narrative of transness. Non-normative gender identities became categorized as a medical problem. Presenting transness as a quote-unquote problem allowed medical practitioners to use their social power to determine what is considered sick or healthy, normal or pathological, sane or insane. Now, 1979 brought the establishment of the Harry Benjamin International Gender Dysphoria Association. This organization was formed with the goal of organizing professionals who were, quote unquote, interested in the study and care of transsexualism and gender dysphoria. It has now since been renamed the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. The association has established internationally accepted guidelines for treating individuals with gender dysphoria, which are periodically updated. The most recent of these guidelines is the Standards of Care version 7, or known as SOC 7, SOC 7. Today, insurance companies, national payers, and treatment teams in both the US and Europe use the SOC 7 guidelines for establishing surgical eligibility. Many centers for transgender medicine and surgery now exist across the US, and the number of gender-affirming surgery operations being performed in the states has increased substantially, along with expanded insurance coverage. In 2015, the U.S. Transgender Survey found that 25% of TGNB individuals had one or more gender-affirming operations. Similar to the earlier wave of clinics, present-day clinics still are frequently composed of an interdisciplinary team of primary care, surgical, and mental health professionals. And although the number of gender-affirming surgeries continues to increase, transgender and gender non-binary patients continue to face significant barriers to accessing the treatment. A 2018 survey of transgender, gender non-binary patients found that the most commonly cited barriers to gender-affirming care are financial concerns, access to physicians who are knowledgeable about gender-affirming surgery, and access to reliable information. These financial concerns can be exacerbated by the cost of obtaining the mental health evaluations recommended by SOC 7 guidelines and insurance coverage. To address these barriers, institutions are considering preoperative models besides the SOC 7 guidelines to potentially reduce the challenges. So folks, as you see, we still have a ways to go in the ethical healthcare of transgender and gender non-binary people in this country. The community is under severe attack throughout many states, and further protection and action is needed, is desperately needed. Please Google your local trans and queer organizations to see how you can get involved. And also, folks, please take some time to read Aaron Wiegand's, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, research on the gatekeeping of gender identity clinics. This is what I referenced throughout this episode. So take some time out. It's really, really a really great read about again the gatekeeping of trans healthcare, and just speaking to how medical narratives can influence medical outcomes as well. So just definitely try to look up the gatekeeping research by Aaron Wiegand's. I hope I'm pronouncing this right. But folks, I'm Lo Weaver. Thank you for stopping by the Bistro this week. Y'all stay safe in these streets. Until next time, deuces. And y'all also remember to follow at The Bistro Pod on Instagram. And now, you can find the video version on YouTube. So you have multiple ways of getting the information. And also check out my Past the Knowledge reels on my Instagram profile at BDL Weaver. So please like, rate, and subscribe the podcast wherever you're listening to it on. Toodles! Oh, that was so much better. Much better. Much better. I still not get I still can't get it. I still can't get it right.